Welcome back! When we last left off, we had addressed how the Syndicate had been formed in the year 1401, and how Ul'dah's history was getting closer and closer to the present day. In the time between now and then, certain pieces have been moving in the background that should be addressed before we continue. After all, when last we unraveled their stories, Ul'dah's history isn't everything you see on the surface. So, let us resume where we left off, discussing what was set in motion ages past, and how it all comes to affect the current day. Now, the first thing most people would notice by now is that Ul'dah's true history doesn't completely match its current history. No one talks about the horrible slavery and murder within the Copperbell mines. No one discusses the backstabbing within the Thaumaturge's Guild. And our largest example are that the atrocities of Ul'dah aren't exactly common knowledge even after being exposed. But why? The smothering of rotten history, for better or worse, began with Baldr Thorn. When Traitor Spurn was used on Ul'dah to create the Plague of Undeath, multiple people knew about it and the devastation it created. You had the thaumaturges who made it, the soldiers who loaded it, and the citizens who witnessed the fallout firsthand. Many people knew exactly what evils Sasaghan III had unleashed. But isn't it funny how scrubbing a name from history will allow it to be completely forgotten in the next few generations? Baldr Thorn knew this, and after realizing the true devastating power of Traitor Spurn, he was resolved to never let it see the light of day again. As Sultan, he decided that something as dangerous as that weapon should be on a need-to-know basis only, and the common folk didn't need to know. All evidence of Traitor Spurn was wiped clean from any text, document, or book, and all people had now was word of mouth. But, as you all know, history is only as reliable as its sources, and without any concrete proof to expose the existence of Traitor Spurn, the knowledge of this undead creating powder began to fade, and eventually disappear. This was why Baldr created the Arbiters of Truth, to keep the original history of Ul'dah and Ul'dah alive. That way, modern history could forget about a weapon that was arguably equal to the Garlean's Black Rose. Whether or not all the Arbiters honored their vows and remained as keepers of secrets is all dependent on who you ask. But what isn't subjective is that this marked the first of many times that the rich and influential people of Ul'dah would make radical choices to direct the eyes of the people away from some dark points in their history. To some, ignorance is bliss. Yet, such a violent game of cloak and dagger would eventually find the throat of a young princess, who would become the Sultana of Ul'dah. But Ul'dah isn't all politics and cover-ups. In fact, there are many things Ul'dah is credited for in helping move society along. Between the creation of the Syndicate almost 200 years to the present day, Ul'dah would solidify its reputation through business dealings, wise investments, and innovative inventions. In the year 1415, the plains of Thanalin were discovered to house a vast quantity of precious metal known as mithril. This began a time called the Mad Mithril Rush, which jump-started Ul'dah's economy and created a time of prosperity for the entire nation. A prosperity that was ultimately shared with their neighbors as trade became even more lucrative between the city-states of Eorzea. In 1466, the Goldsmith Guild perfects the harmonization of aether-infused clockwork engineering, creating the first ever Mammet. This Mammet's name was Mnejing, and would act as the progenitor for all other Mammets that are made in the future. A decade later, in 1476, a merchant named Tatanora would buy a collection of confiscated Ixall blueprints from Gridania. After reading over the Beast Tribe's methods of creating balloons via cerulean vapors, he invented the first wave of floating chocobo wagons. They were a massive success, and these easily drawn coaches are still in use to this very day. 46 years later, Tatanora would again revolutionize Eorzean travel by manufacturing the first line of dirigible-based airships in the year 1522. This eventually led to Tatanora creating the company known as Highwind Skyways in 1531, which produces and organizes commercial airship travel all across Eorzea. If you've ever ridden an airship between the city-states, you can thank Highwind Skyways. But that finally brings us to the year 1555, where the current Sultan, Sasabaru ul Sisibaru, would marry his wife, Nanasha ul Nasha. The reason this pairing is so important is because 1 year later in 1556, the heir to the throne of Ul, Nanamo ul Namo, would be born. But fate isn't always kind, and tragedy would befall the young princess before she could even learn what it is to rule. At the age of only 5 years old, Nanamo's parents both died while traveling abroad for diplomatic conferences. Rumors are of course abundant with what happened. Some say it was a targeted assassination. Others claim it was purely an accident on the road while traveling. But regardless of the means, this left little Nanamo orphaned, and this poor 5-year-old girl was immediately crowned as Sultana of Ul'dah. Of course, no one would take the decisions of such a young ruler seriously, and so Nanamo was essentially made a figurehead of the Syndicate. She would make public appearances, deliver speeches, and make royal decrees, but ultimately all the choices were being made for her by members of the Syndicate. She was simply acting out the policies they themselves were creating. Amongst these policies was reinforcing a law that forbid interaction and trade with certain beast tribes like the Ul'dah. A law that essentially banned all beastmen from the city-state except for the trade-savvy Kikurn. This made some citizens of Ul'dah resent Nanamo, since they saw her as just a puppet for the wealthy and elite of their country. But over the next few years, Nanamo would mature rapidly just to keep her sanity in check, as well as try and survive the vicious game she'd now been thrown into. It was all she could do to keep herself afloat, but by the grace of the gods, she was never truly alone. When Nanamo was made Sultana, a member of the Sultan's Sworn was made to be her personal bodyguard. That paladin was Papashan Nonoshan. He ultimately became the closest thing Nanamo had to family, as he would act as a sort of second father to her. Even after retiring from the Sultan's Sworn, Papashan always made sure to spend time with Nanamo and bestow his wisdom to her when she asked for it. In fact, he was the first person to walk through the city-state with her while she was disguised as someone she called Lady Lilira. But the first major upset in Nanamo's rule would come 4 years after her ascension to the throne. In the year 1565, at only 9 years of age, Nanamo would witness the battles of a man from Alamigo in Ul'dah's Coliseum. He's been forced to fight as a gladiator as he was framed for being a Garlean spy. And on a whim, she waived these accusations and bestowed a royal pardon to the man named Raubahn Aldynn. Before we continue, a bit of history for General Raubahn is necessary. He was born in the year 1533 to a relatively poor family in Alamigo. Once he was in his teens, he would join the Alamigan army in an attempt to make a better living for his family and community. But it's in these early years of service that his resolve would be tested. After the Temple of the Fist was raided, there were tremendous amounts of civil unrest and rioting. He was only 19 years old when this happened, and Raubahn was tasked with suppressing an angry mob. But he astonished everyone with his leadership and people skills when he managed to calm the entire rioting crowd without a single drop of blood being shed. The respect he earned from this event would serve him well, because the next year, the Empire's 14th Legion began to camp outside of Alamigo's borders. The Empire had yet to take their campaign against Alamigo seriously just yet. But that didn't stop Raubahn from leading a small task force that would feed bad intel to Garlean troops. His tactics eventually led to a small border skirmish against a Magitech detachment, which he thoroughly wiped out as he had been teaching himself the ancient Garabonian art of blade dancing. For his leadership and warrior spirit, he was promoted to high command. He took to his new station well, but in the next year he was struck by a Garlean sniper and had to be pulled away from the front lines to recover. While many saw this as unfortunate, this may have been a blessing in disguise, because soon afterward, a civil war would break out in Alamigo against Mad King Theodoric. This was the moment of weakness that the Empire was waiting for, as the full force of the 14th Legion moved in and annexed Alamigo easily. But, during the confusion, a now 24-year-old Raubahn managed to escape Garabania and began wandering Eorzea. He would travel the continent as a wandering swordsman for 3 years before finding himself in a bit of trouble with the brass blades of Ul'dah. Raubahn had been unfairly accused of being an Imperial spy and was imprisoned. After learning about his proficiency with weapons, he was made to fight in Ul'dah's Coliseum as part of his sentence. He was only 27 and would endure life and death battles year after year. But due to his skills in leadership and the use of his blade dancing techniques, he not only won battle after battle, but he gained the love and admiration of the people of Ul'dah, eventually gaining the title the Bull of Alamigo. It would be 6 years after his arrest, but the young Sultana would witness the life of this grizzled man. The match she was watching had been fixed, and Raubahn was most definitely about to die. But before he could be killed, she ordered the match be ended in the name of the Sultana, making all people present within the Coliseum gasp and collectively hold their breath. For someone so young, she was surprisingly calm when she declared that this man would receive her royal pardon, and was hereby freed from his sentence. Raubahn had been forced to fight as a gladiator for more than half a decade, and as a free man, he was finally allowed to partake of the winnings he had been acquiring over that time. He could have run from Ul'dah and never looked back, but upon seeing the purity of heart in the young Sultana's eyes, he knew that he had to repay the life debt he owed her. He swore to Nanamo then and there that one day he'll ascend to the Syndicate and become her blade. This would be the time that the lives of Nanamo Ul'Namo and Raubahn Aldynn would finally converge. Raubahn himself refused to back down and continued to fight in the Coliseum as one of Ul'dah's most beloved gladiators. He even ripped a pair of cursed swords from the cold, dead hands of one of his rivals and eventually forged them into the black blade known as Tizona. And if the rumors are true, the curses within this sword still persist. Curses that may bestow tremendous power to Raubahn, but they would likely set ablaze anyone who couldn't handle Tizona's power. But Raubahn would continue to win fight after fight, earning more fame, recognition, and money with every bout. It would take another 5 years, but Raubahn would achieve 1,000 victories in the year 1570. He had made so much money from his battles and newfound connections that he bought the entirety of the Coliseum out from under Ul'dah, and thusly he was wealthy and influential enough to join the Syndicate. He finally had the money and power to honor his promise to Nanamo, and was now able to proudly stand by her side. If Papashan was a sort of father figure to Nanamo, then Raubahn had become something of a big brother to her. He would remain the only member of the Syndicate that was unquestionably loyal to Nanamo and her rule as Sultana. He did everything in his power to help her achieve her goals for a better and more prosperous Ul'dah. To this end, Raubahn desired to resurrect a long-dead branch of Ul'dah's military. At the time, most of Ul'dah's armed forces were either mercenary groups or free companies hired by members of the Syndicate. And with the ranks of the Sultansworn dwindling year after year, a change needed to be made. At first, the rest of the Syndicate disagreed to the idea of a standing army that would ultimately be under the direct control of the Sultana. But after a lot of wheeling and dealing, Raubahn got what he wanted, and Ul'dah's immortal flames had been born anew. The Immortal Flames currently have the fewest standing members when compared to Gridania's Twin Adder or Limsa Lominsa's Maelstrom, since they only operate with 3 main brigades operating with about 250 to 300 members each. But an advantage that reinforces their numbers is the fact that the Immortal Flames can petition other branches of Ul'dah's armed forces at any time, practically multiplying its power in an instant. They can draft members from the Sultansworn, Brass Blades, Stone Torches, and even the mercenary groups owned by members of the Syndicate. But I would be remiss if I didn't address the Free Brigade. Led by Swift Rider, one of Ul'dah's most famous adventurers, the Free Brigade has a sort of open-door policy with the Adventurers Guild. Any adventurers who are willing to pledge themselves to assist the Immortal Flames may apply, and sometimes this involves entire free companies. But, as you can see, Nanamo had gained an ally she desperately needed. Between Papashan's advice and Raubah's support, she matured into a kind and generous ruler. She may be slightly naive now and then, as the desires for her nation go beyond feasible limits from time to time, but none can deny that her heart has ever been in the right place. Despite the Syndicate hoping to make a political pawn out of the little girl, she's grown into a confident woman who's prepared to make hard choices if it means improving the realm of not only Ul'dah, but all of Eorzea. In fact, through some modest compromises, her ambitions have begun to stretch across the entire world. Ul'dah could not hope for a kinder monarch. And that, my friends, will bring us to the current age. Many things have happened in Ul'dah recently, but that's hardly old history just yet. If you wish, we can cover Ul'dah's fresh wounds some other time. But for now, I do hope you enjoyed this retelling of Ul'dah's famed history, as well as the storied lives of 2 of its most influential people in recent years. It's fair to say that Ul'dah's true history, while mostly obscure, is dark and corrupt. But even with all that being said, a lot of good has come from the city-state as well. For evidence of this, we need not look any further than Ul'dah's flag. Originally, the scales belonged to Belladia. On the left side was the flame of magic. On the right, the fruit of knowledge. When Belladia split into Ul'dah and Sildee, Ul'dah took the flame, and Sildee took the fruit. But as history has proven, might and magic will only take you so far. And so Ul'dah's flag also bears the jewel of prosperity. Prosperity that should benefit all and never the one. Ul'dah was, after all, the only country to really go out of its way for the Alamegan refugees during the Garlean occupation. So while the nation's politics and businessmen may be corrupt and selfish, its people are encouraged to be kind and generous, a precedent that has been set by their endearing Sultana. So I'd ask you all to reflect on what we've discussed. Learn to see the good and bad for what they truly are, and together we'll learn from both their mistakes and triumphs. Until next we meet, stay safe, my friends. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Big shout out to my patrons, Rovakis, Monsolo97, Potato, Runatir, The Yellow Couch, Valen, Papaya Cyan, and Vivalis Oma. If you want to see more lore content in the future, share this with your friends. My dream is to share as much as I find with as many people as possible. And if you do end up helping me, thank you so much in advance. And have a wonderful day.